One-man masterminds the largest gold mining scam in history.
Surely one of the biggest frauds in the history of the world, probably the biggest mining fraud of all time.
He outwitted scientists, analysts, and the world's leading investors.
There was always some science backing up this fraud.
He turned a penny stock into a billion-dollar scam and made himself millions. Find out how, next on Masterminds. On December 13th, 1993, a lone prospector entered the darkest jungles of Borneo and discovered the biggest gold strike of the 20th century.
These series of jungle hills in Indonesia, which all had been formed by a volcano, were lying on top of a pool of gold.
The prospector staked a claim on behalf of a small mining company named Bre-X. He ordered rock samples drilled and sent for testing.
There was some interesting core results, and it seemed like this could be one of those junior plays that made people a lot of money.
Independent auditors assessed the size of the gold deposit as astronomical.
And they started to realize that they had what they thought was an elephant deposit, a great big puddle of gold.
Bre-X stock took off like a rocket. The prospector used the money to expand his operation. He cleared hundreds of acres of jungle and brought in sophisticated excavation machinery.
The analysts on Bay Street and Wall Street got caught up in the excitement.
And every time they published more details about this gold find in Indonesia, the market capitalization of the company, the size of the company, would jump.
This company went from $1 or $2 to $286.
This was the largest gold deposit in the world.
Back in Indonesia, the prospector kept uncovering more and more gold.
Gold was trading at $350 US an ounce. If you multiply it out, it's about $70 billion US.
Fueled by greed, everyone from boardroom executives to middle-class suburbanites wanted in on the action.
Everybody wanted to be the suitor to walk down the aisle with Bre-X.
Even the corrupt Indonesian government tried to muscle in. But what no one knew was, there was no gold, not 1 ounce. The lone prospector cashed in his company's stock options and made off with millions, leaving investors devastated.
People who have basically put a lot of their life savings into Bre-X lose everything. And I know of several individuals who committed suicide.
The prospector had engineered an unparalleled gold rush, outsmarting scientists, analysts, and investors. His name was Michael De Guzman. The question is, how did he do it? Michael De Guzman has convinced the world to invest in a gold mine that isn't there, turning a penny stock into a billion-dollar venture and lining his pockets with millions.
Michael De Guzman was a Filipino geologist who worked in Indonesia.
For years, De Guzman struggles for recognition in an industry dominated by large American mining companies.
Mike De Guzman knew he was smart, he had fabulous marks, he had an engineering degree, but he never got a great job. He never got a crack at a great job. It's very difficult for the Filipinos, even with extremely good engineering training, to get senior jobs with the big mining companies.
While exploring the jungles of Borneo, De Guzman devises a plan to make himself rich. Unable to get the support he needs to find a gold mine, he decides to invent one.
Michael De Guzman was going to get the wealth that he could never aspire to otherwise.
De Guzman reasons that the most convincing site for the world's largest gold mine is on the Indonesian island of Borneo.
In the area around Indonesia is an area which is quite unusually rich in gold. Gold mines are associated with volcanic activity quite a bit, so areas where you get volcanoes, people find gold mines.
De Guzman concocts a geological theory to capitalize on what the experts already believe.
And the theory essentially was, where there are extinct volcanoes, you're going to kind of have a plug of minerals, like gold, that are fairly close to the surface.
Now De Guzman must find someone with credibility to sell his idea to the world. He targets geologist John Felderhoff.
John Felderhoff is the very sort of person you would imagine that would be crazy enough to go through the jungles of Kalimantan or Borneo, wearing hip waders and looking for gold.
He had actually a well-established reputation of having discovered a gold mine in Indonesia.
De Guzman convinces Felderhoff to find a foreign investor who's willing to take risks and not ask questions. Felderhoff recommends a businessman from Western Canada.
David Walsh was this promoter. He'd been bankrupt. He'd been sort of living out of the trunk of his car. He was the kind of guy who was always talking up a story.
Walsh is flown to Indonesia, where he's wined and dined in the finest hotel in Jakarta.
Walsh was at a point where he was looking for some promising properties, and he spent basically his last few bucks to take a trip to Indonesia.
With nothing more than a few rocks, maps, and some questionable data, De Guzman sells Walsh on investing 80 grand on a property in Borneo that he's never even seen. It's called Busang.
The thing that made the Bre-X fraud credible in everybody's eyes was that one of the largest gold mines in the world is in the Indonesian islands, about 70 miles away from what became Busang.
In exchange for their work exploring Busang, De Guzman demands stock options for himself and Felderhoff. Now De Guzman sets out to turn this penny stock company into a corporation worth billions. He starts by hiring a young Filipino staff, over which he has total control.
So the person really in charge on site in Busang was Michael De Guzman.
De Guzman orders his team to drill core samples. Once extracted, the core sample is split in two. Typically, half is stored on site. The other half is then crushed and sent to a lab to be tested, determining how much gold is present. But because De Guzman knows the property has no gold, he employs an age-old mining trick called salting.
Salting refers to adding gold to the ore. Usually what would happen is you'd have a gold mine and you go there and you take gold nuggets, sprinkle it around the way you'd sprinkle salt around.
De Guzman orders the crushed rock moved to a locked shed, where he's sure to have absolute privacy. Inside, he devises an ingenious method of salting the samples, with gold filed from his wedding ring.
Adding it to the ground-up rock. As far as I know, that's not been done before. That was a novel twist.
The challenge to Michael is then taking 40 pounds of rock and figuring out exactly how many gold flakes should go in there. In other words, there's 3 ounces of gold per ton of rock. So he's got to do a fair amount of division, and he's got to carefully weigh out his gold.
If he'd grabbed a teaspoonful and chucked it in, the gold grade would have been phenomenal, and people would have gone, and it would have attracted attention.
De Guzman's calculations are perfect. The lab results suggest high levels of gold without raising suspicion. De Guzman has his frontman, John Felderhoff, call David Walsh at his home in Western Canada and tell him the good news. The lab results are the equivalent of a hot tip.
The market came to really look forward to these results. You know, there'd be a big excitement. Walsh would say, on Tuesday, we should have core results for you. Tuesday would come, sure enough, there'd be 10 or 12 new holes.
As each consecutive lab result is posted, it appears that more and more gold is being found in Busang. Investors rush to buy Bre-X shares listed on the Alberta Stock Exchange in Canada. There's so much drilling at Busang that De Guzman needs a larger supply of gold in order to keep salting the thousands of samples.
There's a lot of local Indonesian natives who make their living, or at least a part of their living, by panning for gold in the rivers. Michael befriended this fellow and started buying gold off him. So over a period of about 2 years, Michael bought about $61,000 worth of gold off this guy.
Meanwhile, investors anxious to get in on the deal send over an independent auditor to review all De Guzman's records. The auditor demands to see De Guzman's core samples. But De Guzman hasn't saved half the samples.
They did split their core all right, but they only kept 10 centimeters out of every meter. That's very unusual.
To prevent the auditor from becoming suspicious, De Guzman is ready with an explanation. He cites a phenomenon called the nugget effect, in which the gold is distributed unevenly. De Guzman insists he must crush all of the sample in order to get an accurate reading.
The key was crushing up all the core. Nobody could check. By having crushed up all the core, basically they destroyed the evidence.
But when the auditor takes a closer look at the samples, he's suspicious about the river gold purchased by De Guzman.
The gold you get from panning in a river looks quite different from the gold that you find at the bottom of a gold mine. River gold gets rounded around the edges. The flakes of gold are shaped by the forces of the water and the weather.
De Guzman uses his theory of volcanic pools to explain why this kind of gold is precisely what you would expect at Busang. Within hours, the Bre-X website announces the successful audit and the stock rises dramatically.
You could watch this stock move. It would go from $20 to $30 in the space of 3 weeks.
Building on his success with the auditor, De Guzman now moves to drive the stock price even higher.
They looked at their maps and they said, okay, well, if there's gold here, maybe there'll be gold over here as well. And that's when they got into Busang 2.
De Guzman finds enough surface gold to convince David Walsh to finance drilling for what he claims is a second massive gold deposit. Once again, De Guzman has Felderhoff fire off a message to David Walsh. We've got a monster by the tail. Walsh pounces on it. He applies for Bre-X to be listed on the NASDAQ and the Toronto Stock Exchange.
Wall Street and investors elsewhere and analysts elsewhere were totally on side, were totally enthusiastic, were totally hypnotized by the rising stock price, by the rising claims of Bre-X.
Now De Guzman makes his boldest claim. Based on drilling results from Busang 2, he declares that Bre-X has the largest gold deposit in the world.
The investors just looked at the rising stock price and said, this must be real.
Having built Bre-X into a company worth $6 billion, and with its stock price at nearly $300 a share, it's time for De Guzman to start cashing in. He and his team sell enough shares to be rewarded with over $100 million.
When Felderhoff and when Walsh and when De Guzman started selling a part of their holdings, but not all of it, people just figured, well, that's just guys who've had a tough run all their lives, and they're just taking out some insurance.
De Guzman is now worth millions. But what he doesn't know is the Indonesian government is about to make a move that threatens to reveal his scam. Michael De Guzman has pulled off the biggest fraud in mining history. He's fooled the world's leading investors, turned a penny stock into a billion-dollar venture, and lined his pockets with millions. But he's now facing a real crisis.
The beginning of the end for Bre-X was a problem in Indonesia. The Indonesian government, which is hideously corrupt, decides to challenge Bre-X's claim to this fabulous deposit.
In August of 1996, the Indonesian government revokes Bre-X's exploration permit and opens the property to other mining companies.
The government itself was going to get very much involved in the ownership of the deposit, and they were going to invite who they wanted to see to develop the deposit.
So what you saw unfold in rather ugly fashion between the summer of 1996 and the spring of 1997 was this fight amongst major companies for a piece of the action.
Michael De Guzman knows his drilling records will soon come under scrutiny from the other mining companies, a move that's sure to reveal the Bre-X fraud. Desperate, he destroys all his records at Busang, claiming it was an accidental fire.
What went up in smoke that day would ultimately help cover the trail of the conspirators that did this fraud.
The Indonesian government forces Bre-X to accept a new mining partner, Freeport-McMoRan. From now on, Bre-X owns only 45% of Busang. When news gets out, Bre-X stock drops $1 billion. But De Guzman counters. He releases new drilling results that dramatically increase the estimated gold reserves underground.
They had previously said that they had 57 million reserves, and they increased that to slightly over 70 million reserves. Given that the ownership that they had in percentage went down, to make the value be the same, they had to increase the reserves.
Bre-X stock rises again. Shareholders are thrilled. In the spring of 1997, De Guzman and his team are invited to be guests of honor at Bre-X's annual shareholder meeting in Toronto, Canada.
Michael De Guzman made a presentation as part of the Bre-X annual meeting to talk about what he'd found and to talk about what the different drill results had proven that was underneath the ground. He was able to stand before shareholders with this fabulously expensive stock, a company that's worth $5 billion, and said, look, we did the best deal we could under the circumstances. We're all rich. Isn't this great?
He was widely applauded, considered a hero. His theories of mining, even though they were slightly unusual, seemed to be validated by the results.
But on the other side of the world, Bre-X's new partner is anxiously drilling for gold, only yards away from where De Guzman had drilled.
And their samples came up empty. They weren't finding the gold that Michael De Guzman had said was there.
De Guzman got the phone call, "We don't seem to find any of the gold you say is there. Get your story behind, back to Indonesia pronto, pal, and explain this to us."
After 3 years and billions of dollars, time is running out for the mastermind behind the world's largest fraud. When Bre-X's powerful new partner doesn't find gold at Busang, Michael De Guzman is forced back to Indonesia.
The next morning, he climbs into the back of a helicopter driven by a Indonesian Air Force officer, takes off over the jungle. He's about 400 or 500 feet in the air over some of the deepest rainforest in all of Indonesia. And the pilot looked into the back seat, and De Guzman was gone. De Guzman had jumped out of the helicopter, apparently.
3 days later, the Indonesian army claims to find De Guzman's body. It's badly decomposed and partially eaten by animals. It's so gruesome, the authorities won't let his family view the remains.
It was very difficult to believe that they took 2-3 days, I recall, to find the body, when in fact the pilot said he did set the GPS recorder, so they should have been able to find the spot.
Rumors swirl about De Guzman's death. Was it suicide, murder, or yet another perfectly planned deception?
If you wanted to disappear anywhere on this planet, Indonesia would be one of the easier places to do it. That you could, for a few $100s, purchase a recently deceased body.
Independent drilling takes place directly beside where De Guzman took thousands of samples, and not a single ounce of gold is found.
They go and they drill their own core samples, and the security they have around that is unmatched. They are drilling 2 or 3 feet away from where Bre-X says there's tons of gold. All they find is rock flake. There is no gold there.
It looked so good, it couldn't be real. I mean, it was too good to be real.
It's an unbelievable revelation. They just can't believe that this fabulous deposit, in fact, never existed.
Investors around the world suddenly realize they've been had.
Walsh is just flabbergasted. He cannot believe that this is happening. And it's that point that the Bre-X team in Toronto realizes that they've got nothing to go on, that their stock is going to zero because this was a massive fraud. The shares themselves are only useful as wallpaper.
David Walsh adamantly denies any knowledge of the fraud. He moves to the Bahamas with his wife. 2 years later, he dies of a massive heart attack.
John Felderhoff continues to live in a gorgeous home right next to the yacht club in the Cayman Islands, where there's no tax and there's also no extradition treaty with Canada for white-collar crimes.
Michael De Guzman, the mastermind behind the greatest mining scam of all time, is supposedly laid to rest.
I compare him to Rumpelstiltskin. He was able to turn a very small amount of gold into a huge amount. He spun a story into a huge amount of gold.
No criminal charges have arisen out of the Bre-X scandal. No one has ever spent a day in jail as a result of it.
The fraud itself has changed the way that Canadian regulators look at the mining industry.
It would be somewhat more difficult to pull off a similar type of scam, but it isn't impossible. It's probably still could be done again.
The adage, caveat emptor, is indeed true. Buyer beware.
In spite of class action lawsuits, not one investor has ever been compensated. A harsh reality for thousands of ordinary people who invested their life savings in Bre-X and were left penniless.
I actually believe that Michael De Guzman is alive. I don't think that he did fall out of that helicopter. I believe that he faked his own death and that he's enjoying the money that he scammed at Bre-X.
The press called him Indiana Jones, a daring tomb raider who looted ancient artifacts from Egypt.
He obviously recognized that there was a potential to make a huge income from smuggling these antiquities into the West and selling them.
His accomplices idolized him as a master of deception.
The idea behind the smuggling operation is a fantastic, very, very clever idea. It's brilliant.
He was a top player in a dangerous game.
I was immensely proud of what I was doing. It's a game which requires wit and skill and very good nerves.
For 10 years, he eluded authorities on 2 continents and made millions. Find out how he did it. Next on Masterminds. Beneath the sands of Egypt lie the remains of 5,000 years of human history. In the early 90s, there was an upsurge in the smuggling of these ancient artifacts.
Property was being excavated from the ground and then suddenly turning up in the West and being sold for huge profits.
In an effort to protect their priceless cultural heritage, Egyptian authorities cracked down. Security was dramatically increased.
The risks are considerable. Egyptian prisons are not a place that you want to spend a great deal of time in.
But in London, the center of the illegal antiquities trade, British authorities noticed a flood of illicit goods still coming onto the market.
Various people across the Western world were prepared to pay bigger and bigger money. Presuming that you have the expertise, you can make millions of pounds per year.
Police feared someone had found a way to beat the system.
He was manipulating the whole system for financial gain. He exploits the antiquity market, but he exploits it brilliantly.
Then in 1993, a 3,000-year-old sculpture of an ancient pharaoh, Amenhotep III, came onto the London market.
It was an extremely significant piece. It was a very rare piece.
At the height of the Gulf War, with security at an all-time high, a master smuggler had found a way to do the impossible.
If I had been caught at that time, they'd have killed me.
His most brilliant move was being able to transport it out of Egypt without raising any questions.
To get the piece out of the country, he took the shadowy art of smuggling to a level law enforcement had never seen before. Back in England, the statue was transformed from contraband into a legitimate collector's piece and sold for over $1 million.
He was a mastermind of smuggling antiquities from Egypt.
A lot of the newspapers over here saw me as a sort of Indiana Jones. I saw myself as something very old-fashioned and very traditional, doing something that the English do well, smuggling with calm nerves and moral courage, and a sense of fun, sense of humour.
Jonathan Tockley Perry was a dashing romantic figure and one of the most ingenious smugglers of the 20th century. The question is, how did he do it? Jonathan Tockley Perry is one of the 20th century's greatest antiquities smugglers, eluding massive security to escape from Egypt with $1 million sculpture. But this mastermind with nerves of steel didn't start out like Indiana Jones. Born into a middle-class family, Tockley Perry is accepted into prestigious Cambridge University. He develops an interest in art and antiquities and reinvents himself as an upper-class gentleman.
My family wanted me to get on a train and go into the city and make a lot of money and have a heart attack when I was 50. And I point blank refused.
He's a complex character. He has almost a heightened sense of honour. He wanted to go into the army, but was turned down. He then joined the territorial army, sort of weekend soldiers, part-timers.
Denied the opportunity to pursue a full-time military career, Tockley Perry returns to his first love, the past.
Just touching something ancient was a wonderful feeling. You catch a vibration, and I knew that that was what I wanted to do.
After training as an antiquities restorer, he quickly gains an international reputation.
I was the highest paid restorer in England, probably Europe. But I still could not afford to buy any of these wonderful objects. I would have the most stunning things on my table that I restored and brought back to life, and then I'd have to give them back. And I realized that a restorer is just a servant.
What Tockley Perry wants is to be his own master.
He was restoring objects for dealers who were selling them for thousands or even hundreds of thousands of pounds. And I think his head was turned.
He obviously recognised that there was a potential to make a huge income from smuggling these antiquities into the West and selling them.
Egypt is the place if you have a passion for antiquities. 3,000 years of continuous civilization, an enormous number of objects and buildings, and the feeling that at any time something wonderful is going to turn up.
Tockley Perry travels to Cairo under the guise of a researcher. There he makes contact with a local smuggler.
He befriended a chap called Ali Farag, who was the youngest of a large family, all of whom were engaged in smuggling antiquities out of Egypt.
Ali Farag tells Tockley Perry about an artifact that has been found at a construction site. But the Gulf War is raging, and Tockley Perry must proceed with extreme caution.
The country was under full military alert. Foreigners were being arrested if they were seen with Egyptians. I was actually hiding in the boot of the car because there were roadblocks everywhere. Went out to the southern suburbs of Cairo.
A building contractor with connections to the smuggling underworld has unearthed an ancient artifact. Tockley Perry realizes he's looking at a 3,000-year-old sculpture that will make him a very rich man, if he can keep his cool.
The Egyptians are the best salesmen in the world. They're psychologically so brilliant.
The high-stakes game begins.
He was looking at me, and I met his eyes and looked away. The last thing I'm going to do is let this one go, because I've been waiting for 5 years for this.
Tockley Perry is desperate, but so is the contractor. Jonathan calls his bluff.
The Egyptians were panicking. They were desperate for currency.
Now the master dealmaker drives a very hard bargain. $6,000 cash for $1 million piece of history.
I had my first world-class piece. There wasn't any period of feeling, oh, the world is wonderful, God's on my side. All I realized was, oh, Christ, how am I going to get this out?
Because being caught with the piece could be fatal, he must think fast.
His most brilliant move, and the move that no one else had identified, was the actual disguising of the piece.
And that meant preparing it, which was to make the object look as much as possible like a kitsch, bizarre thing, the sort that idiots buy in the hotel shops all the time. To do this, I had to take a battered antiquity and make it look like a modern, complete object. So I had to build up, make up the things which were missing.
He coats the statue with a gum and applies gold leaf. He polishes the leaf, then paints the sculpture so it looks like a cheap souvenir. He then buys a real souvenir, keeps the receipt, removes the base, and places the sculpture on it.
Having done that, the object looked absolutely ghastly, but it gave us a good chance of getting through. Security was doubled. There were armed soldiers everywhere. In fact, it was just complete bloody madness for me to do it. And the consequences of getting it wrong would be really, really nasty. I would have been taken to the desert and not come back.
At the airport, security is everywhere. Tokely Perry is stopped by the antiquities police.
Made me open the suitcase, and he said, "What is this?" I said, "Oh, it's a present. Here's the receipt." And I tried to distract him by holding the receipt. And then the bit I dreaded. He reached into his pocket and he brought out his bloody keys. Now, Egyptians are very good with keys. They get a key and they scratch the surface. And I knew that if he scratched on the face, he would go straight through to the stone and I'd be buggered. And as he went to scratch, I said, "No, no, not there, underneath, much better." I had to get him down to the base where I'd prepared an extra inch of plaster just for him to scratch. And he saw the plaster, looked at it, and waved his hand and wandered off. And thank God I got it right.
Back in England, he sails through customs. But his work is far from complete. First, he must remove the elaborate disguise without damaging the sculpture. Breaking the gilding and plaster is far too risky, but his expert knowledge of chemistry pays off. Before he covered the statue in plaster, he coated it with a protective layer of plastic.
I put it into a bath of acetone, and gradually, gently, everything will float off, leaving the antiquity exactly as I received it in Egypt.
He then took it to the next stage, where he actually changed the eye line, he added part of the beard to it. In his own words, give it a better line so that the collectors would pay more money for it.
But if buyers suspect the piece is stolen, they'll alert police. So he now forges documents to give the statue a convincing history.
To make the labels, I took some Victorian pharmacy labels, cut out the letters, rearranged them, had them printed on a very old stock of paper, and then practiced my copperplate 20s handwriting with ink which I'd chemically faded. And then, having cut out the label, I aged it, I soaked it in tea, I dried it, I wet it, I dried it again. So I had a label that looked thoroughly scratched and ancient.
He glues the label to the back of the sculpture.
It would appear that the object hadn't come from Egypt at all, had come from an old country collection in England.
Tokely Perry is now ready to strike. Through his network of international antiquities dealers, he sells the sculpture for $1 million.
I couldn't believe it. It seemed that I'd actually achieved what I wanted in one hit.
But this success is just the beginning, and Tokely Perry's ambition to be the world's greatest antiquities smuggler will soon threaten to bring him down. Jonathan Tokely Perry has made $1 million smuggling the sculpture of Amenhotep III. Over the next 4 years, he continues to secretly export Egyptian antiquities and reaps a fortune.
Jonathan indulged himself with his lifestyle. He had several suits made by his Devon tailor. He bought an extremely expensive sports car.
I made millions of pounds, which was nice. It's nice to be paid for what you love doing.
As soon as the money got bigger, the objects got bigger, and the whole game became more dangerous and more sophisticated, he realised that he needed a mule to carry these pieces out.
Jonathan targets Mark Perry, a local handyman.
Jonathan Perry walked in and I was sort of awestruck by him. I think he saw I was gullible in the first place. He knew that, you know, here's a lad, a young family, very short of money.
Tokely Perry offers Mark £500 a week, plus all the adventure he can handle.
Somebody comes along to me and says, you're going over to Egypt, you're going to stay in a hotel, all expenses paid, and I'm going to pay you for it. But I had the chance of adventure, I had the chance of money, and getting away from the day-to-day realities of life. I could actually do something.
Tokely Perry soon introduces his protege to Egypt's smuggling underworld.
We arrived in Cairo, and nothing prepared me for what I was about to feel that day. Just amazing to see. And of course, again, I was awestruck by it all.
I showed Mark what I was doing.
He even trained him in how to camouflage the objects. And then Mark would bring them back to this country.
And I took him through customs once to show him the techniques. And I instructed him very, very carefully what to do if there was any problem.
I did all the dirty donkey work. It was my life on the line. I've carried £500,000 worth of antiquity in a bag through the centre of Cairo and not even thought anything of it. Didn't even realise what I had. All I was wanting to do was get back for a beer in the bar.
With his mule in place, Tokely Perry now hires a more sophisticated partner to help negotiate with the Egyptians. He makes a deal with Andrew May, an aristocrat fallen on hard times.
We had a gentleman's understanding that he would only take the smaller pieces that were no longer of any concern to me, and that he would train himself in the market. And eventually, maybe in a decade's time, he would take over from me.
But Andrew May soon turns out to be a problem.
The mistake he made with Andrew May was that, having gone to Egypt and seen the huge amounts of money that could be made, and Andrew May began buying pieces and bringing them out, as well as bringing out Jonathan's pieces.
He was too greedy and too hungry and too frightened, and he tried, putting it very simply, to rip me off.
The big difference between Jonathan and Andrew was that Jonathan had worked with antiquities for many, many years as a restorer. Jonathan had done his homework. Andrew, in the space of months, tried to pull off the same act and lacked the knowledge.
In Cairo, May buys a collection of rare ancient Egyptian documents known as papyrus. But fearing the artifacts are fake, he takes them to the British Museum to be authenticated.
It was one of the most stupid things that you could possibly have done.
Museum archaeologists quickly realize these are artifacts that they had originally discovered and that had been stolen in Egypt. They contact police.
When we were contacted by the British Museum, formed an opinion immediately that it was such a dumb thing to have done that this person couldn't possibly be responsible for the theft and the looting of this material. When we started to research Andrew May, we found that he was the owner of a manor house in Devon. One of his tenants was Jonathan Tokely Perry, somebody who had a large collection of Egyptian material and was working as a restorer.
The police are ready to move against Tokely Perry. But when they arrive at his home, he isn't there. They have to break in.
We found Jonathan Tokely Perry's workshop. And it was in the workshop that we found a vast amount of antiquities.
So it was fortuitous, or perhaps unfortuitous for Jonathan, that he turned up while we were in his house.
When I got to my front door, I could see that my kitchen window had been smashed. And there was a grey, stout man there. And I said to him, "Have I been burgled? What's happening?" And he said, "We're the police." And I said, "Oh, thank God you're here." And he said, "Well, actually, we did that, and we're here to arrest you." And I said, "Well, why couldn't you bloody knock like anybody else?"
Jonathan reacted in a typical Jonathan way. He put on his superior air, that he was better than anyone else who might be there. He huffed and puffed. He had a rational explanation for everything that he was doing.
Jonathan Tokely Perry is arrested on the charge of handling stolen property. His 10-year, multi-million-dollar smuggling operation has finally caught up with him. But putting him in prison will prove extremely difficult. Jonathan Tokely Perry is arrested, but cannot be charged with smuggling because his crimes were committed in Egypt.
And to actually prosecute Jonathan in this country was not easy.
The police are forced to charge him with the lesser crime of handling stolen property. Although he is eventually found guilty, authorities are troubled by the difficulty of bringing him to justice. As a result, new laws are enacted, giving police the power to charge smugglers in their country of residence.
The case itself has redrawn the legal lines for the antiquities market, the antiquities trade in not just this country, not just in the USA, but for the world.
But to this day, Tokely Perry believes he did nothing wrong.
I was immensely proud of what I was doing because, having seen what was going on in Egypt, I was aware that if it weren't for people like me, a lot of those objects would be destroyed.
I've no doubt that he justified his actions to himself through being the modern-day Robin Hood, saving antiquities for the world. Despite what Jonathan would like to think of himself, he is and was a criminal.
After serving 3 years of a 6-year sentence, Jonathan Tokely Perry is released. He is currently working again as a restorer and is often consulted by police investigating the illegal antiquities trade. A lone woman pulls off the biggest home burglary spree in American history.
She's this criminal mastermind that became this sort of folk hero in South Florida.
Stealing over $6 million in jewelry, furs, and artwork.
She's basically shopping through these people's houses.
She changed her appearance like a chameleon.
And left the police helpless to stop her.
And I said to myself, my God, where is she not hitting? How about the Bahamas? Are they safe? How is this woman not getting caught?
Find out how she did it next on Masterminds. During the early 1980s, cocaine wars caused an unprecedented urban crime wave in Miami. To escape, the affluent moved further north to gated and patrolled communities like Boca del Mar and Boca Raton.
It was people getting out of Miami. They were people with money. There was a lot of wealth, fabulous wealth along the intercoastal.
But in 1984, these well-protected communities were hit by a spree of over 500 home burglaries.
It was not uncommon for us in a 5-day period to investigate anywhere from 10 to 12 burglaries in Boca del Mar or in the Boca Raton area. The frequency and the dollar loss started to mount real quick.
The people of Boca del Mar could not go to work and do their shopping without having to worry that their homes were being burglarized.
The loss was not only staggering in dollar amount, but it was alarming in that it wasn't just the typical jewelry and or, say, expensive electronic equipment. It was just about anything of value.
All of South Florida was being racked by this one burglar. It wasn't your typical run-of-the-mill crook that we were dealing with. I mean, burglaries went unsolved.
Police discover similar MOs in all the crimes.
The burglaries always occurred during Monday through Friday. The point of entry was always through the front door. and that pillowcases were missing from the master bedroom. There was no witnesses, there was no latent prints. The perpetrator was obviously the same person.
The police were unable to identify the perpetrator because they assumed the crimes could only have been committed by a man.
This completely blew me off my feet. Here I'm dealing with a prolific burglar who's a woman and very good at what she does.
That was what was so cool about it. You know, she wasn't the person that I imagined stealing my VCR.
Judy Amar was the mastermind behind America's largest home burglary spree, stealing over $6 million in furs, jewelry, and artwork.
It was just an exciting feeling. I just thought, wow, this is marvelous. Catch me if you can.
The question is, how did she do it? Judy Amar is the mastermind behind the greatest home burglary spree in U.S. history, leaving the police helpless to stop her. Amar grew up poor on an Arkansas farm.
Very boring, not adventuresome. It was a farming community, and I really didn't like what I was doing.
After an unwanted teenage pregnancy, she leaves her child to be raised by her parents and moves to Miami.
I was told that, nobody wanted me, I wasn't good looking. The same thing that most girls get in trouble for.
In Miami, desperate to support herself, she accepts an offer from a boyfriend to help him rob homes.
So I needed money. He asked me to drive him somewhere because no one would be suspicious of a woman. You go in the house, you look for the jewelry. That's it, you come back to the car. He wasn't really that good at it. He always seemed to mess up everything.
During a burglary, Judy and her accomplice are arrested by the police. However, due to insufficient evidence, all charges are dropped.
From now on, if I'm taking a chance of getting arrested, and I'm going alone, it was better because I didn't have to worry about him messing up something or getting in my way. So that's when I started.
She had a lot of different abilities that made it a natural choice, so to speak, for her. She had a plan and a scheme, and that's what made her different than your average burglar.
Amar now sets out to revolutionize home burglary, starting with how she finds her targets.
The Sunday real estate section was Judy's Guide to Burglary. It's where developers of housing projects try to tout the amenities they're offering in their homes. Basically, they lay out all these floor plans, which for a burglar, in hindsight, it's incredible information. She used that to her advantage. She could see whether these homes were being sold, for instance, with security systems installed. She could see if the doors were recessed, just from looking at the house diagrams. She could plan 30 burglaries in 30 different brand new neighborhoods sitting there with the Palm Beach Post.
Having determined her target, Amar now creates the perfect persona for herself.
The wigs were, by far and away, the greatest asset she had in trying to disguise herself.
I had several different ones. I had a long, straight with bangs, one that was done with curls that was frosted. I had an afro. I had a short one, but I would just change.
Judy knew how to dress when she went out. High heels. She always wore high heels. Slacks, because she did know that she might have to make some sort of getaway. She just looked good, she looked like she belonged.
No one would give her a second thought because professional businesswomen is a very common occurrence here in Boca del Mar and in Boca Raton. Very common to see a woman executive or a woman real estate agent dressed this way.
She could go into gated communities and just, wave at the guard. Hi, how you doing? And she'd look like she belonged there, which is something that her compatriots couldn't pull off.
The next step in Amar's plan is to obtain untraceable transportation.
The idea is to change the automobiles as often as possible. If the police are looking for a red Plymouth, You come back in a blue Chevrolet, you completely befuddled everyone. They're not looking for that car.
At least once a week, she rents a different car and always pays in cash.
So you give them $300, $500, and you take the car. As long as you keep the payments up, you don't have a problem.
To further ensure her vehicle is untraceable, Amar changes the license number to prevent witnesses from correctly identifying her car. Having found her target and secured transportation, Amar now determines the perfect time to strike.
She would look for our deputies, and she'd stay back several car lengths and just watch them and follow them. And if he went into a particular restaurant, she knew that darn well that the deputy was now going to eat. That's a good 30 minutes.
For Amar, this is the window of opportunity. She heads immediately to her target. She has chosen this house because its recessed front door helps conceal her activities.
Because I would have covering, and the people next door really couldn't see anyone standing there.
She would put that Gucci bag on her arm and strides right up to the door like she belonged there. She knew where she was going. She'd knock on the door. She could think on her feet. Someone caught her in the act of something. She would say, "Oh, I've got the wrong house. I'm so sorry to bother you." She leaves. But if there's no one there, no one answers the knock, no dogs are barking, she goes to work.
And inside of her purse was her 12-inch long screwdriver.
She knew exactly where to place the screwdriver to get this door open.
She would insert the blade of the screwdriver between the frame of the door and the locking mechanism and jam it as far as she could possibly get it and begin to bend it. And eventually the lock is wide open and she uses the screwdriver to push the lock back. Now she's got an entry into the house.
The only problem is, she's triggered the alarm system.
Judy was not afraid of alarms.
The vast majority of alarm calls are false alarms, and the police know that, and Judy knew that.
The master bedroom was first. At that point, she knew she had about 60 seconds before the alarm system would go off. She'd go to the closet, get the designer clothes, grab a pillowcase off the bed.
She knew what she was looking for. Things that would sell well.
It was a strand of pearls with a piece of jade in the middle, and it had sapphires and diamonds around it.
She's basically shopping through these people's houses.
There was 2 Paget watches, beautiful antique pieces.
Things that she would like and might keep for herself.
Amar is in and out in 90 seconds, but she's so bold, she goes back for more.
After I got that in the car, I had seen the Remington statue on the way out, and I went back in and took it.
Judy Amar is at the height of her powers, stealing $250,000 worth of goods in a single burglary. The only problem is her past is about to catch up with her. America's most prolific home burglar, Judy Amar, has broken into hundreds of houses and scored over $6 million in jewelry, furs, and art.
Now they've increased from 1 reported on Tuesday and 1 on Wednesday to 2 or 3 on Monday, 4 on Tuesday, 2 on Wednesday. I mean, she was just having a field day. She was going wild.
Then in 1985, the police finally get a lucky break.
And a man came home from work and actually found Judy in his house. And she literally ran right past him, got in the car and drove away.
For the first time, the police realize the criminal they're searching for is a woman.
One of the other detectives had remembered a woman who years before had been arrested for the same thing in the same area.
When the police search their database for that period, it reveals Judy's name.
I mean, it lit up just like if you hit 777 on a slot machine in Vegas. We got Judy's picture, put it in a lineup, brought it to him, and instantly he picked her out, said that was the woman.
The police also established the make and model of Judy's car. They issue a statewide bulletin. Despite her close call, Judy brazenly targets a second home that day.
One of our deputies had been alerted we were looking for a particular car that Judy was using. It was a blue Chevrolet. He's yelling into the radio that he had found the car and it was unoccupied. So he took up a position and waited for the troops to get there.
And there was police dragnet forming, and she knew that she was about to get cornered.
Amar escapes out the back, then breaks into the house next door, where she finds a set of car keys.
And I pulled the wig off and go, because if someone had seen me and gave a description, they're giving the wrong one. I look nothing like it.
There's a Mercedes sedan parked in the garage. And she's so brazen, she waved to an officer, the officer waves back, and she got away. She just drives right through the police dragnet.
One of the detectives who she drove by, he had no real clue what she looked like that day because she changed her appearance like a chameleon. Today she could be a redhead, tomorrow she's a blonde, and on Friday she would be a brunette. This woman was good. When we realized that she had given us the slip, and I remember the temper tantrum that I had, which wasn't pretty, I was livid. I was angry at no one but Judy, and pretty much said to myself, okay, you just made this personal now. This case then came home with me. I had a closet in my house, and I used it as a little mini office. And I would work on this thing at night on my own time. And this became an obsession with me.
Scanning burglary reports from across the state, Tomasi recognizes Judy's MO and realizes she's hitting a much larger territory than he suspected.
She likes to travel. The city of Delray Beach is notifying us that they're having burglaries that match Judy's MO to the T. The city of Boca Raton is, the city of Plantation is, the city of Sunrise is, and then the city of Naples, which is on the other side of Florida, is telling us that they have cases that match. And I said to myself, my God, where is she not hitting? How about the Bahamas? Are they safe? I mean, you know, just how is this woman not getting caught?
It was a lot of work. You had to get up in the mornings just like you were going to a job. You had to find an area to burglarize. Sometimes it was from 8 till 6 or 7 at night.
As Judy's spree continues, police trace her abandoned blue Chevrolet back to a car rental agency near the airport.
They identified her and said, yeah, she comes in here on a regular basis. So now they knew she was wanted. They no longer wanted to do business with her, and they said, if she comes, we're going to call the police.
Tomasi now ups the ante.
We found out about her family in Arkansas and did a background on her son.
At his request, the FBI detains Judy's son.
We kind of figured if we put pressure on her family, that's going to be her Achilles heel. So we started talking to her son. Do you really want to have your mom resisting us and getting herself killed? We don't want your mom getting hurt. She's the one who's upping the ante on this every week.
The son refuses to give his mother up. When Judy learns the FBI is leaning on her family, she's outraged.
That hit a sore spot with Judy. That was her Achilles heel, was her son, because she became livid with me, and she called me from somewhere in Miami.
And told him to leave my family alone, that my family had nothing to do with this, and I was not in Arkansas.
She was furious at me for reaching out for her family. But if that's what it takes, then that's what it takes.
He said, you need to turn yourself in. I said, I can't do that.
Judy Amar's refusal to surrender, however, is about to threaten both her life and Ron Tomasi's. "16 months pass in the Amar burglary investigation, without the police getting any closer to catching her.
They didn't know where to find her. They were being driven crazy. Poor Ron Tomasi, he became obsessed with finding Judy to the point where the little things that she would do would irritate him to no end. And he'd just get more and more stressed.
I said, I'm living this case, I'm eating this case, I'm breathing this case. I can't sleep at night because of this case.
And I love police detectives, but they're the most macho, guys in the world. They don't want anyone to get away with anything. But here's somebody who's clever and smarter and a woman, and they can't catch a girl. There was just something that was galling about that.
Pushed to the point of exhaustion, Tomasi suffers a heart attack and is forced off duty for weeks.
He was so obsessed with it, I think that was his problem. He had his hands full. His children even knew my name.
The very day that I went back to work, I was notified that Judy Amar had been identified as hiding in a motel in Surfside from an informant in Miami.
I think if it had not been for this guy and a drug charge, trying to get a lenient sentence, well, he told on him. He told her where she was.
With an army of undercover agents, Tomasi stakes out the motel.
So we had snipers and everybody in place. We didn't know what we were going to deal with, whether she was going to quietly submit to us or we would have to shoot it out. She came home at about 8:20, 8:30 in the morning. She comes to her door. And the moment she put the key into the motel door to open it, everybody came out.
I remember turning around, and the black guy, I think, had the chain with his badge around it. He's in a squat position with a gun like this.
She was so completely stunned, she said that she looked around, there were guns everywhere. She just surrendered. Thank God, she just surrendered and it was over. The room was filled from top to bottom, from wall to wall, with statues, clothing, shoes, apparel, jewelry. You just couldn't imagine. It looked like a little warehouse or a little store. I remember when we sat as close as we are now, and I looked into her eyes, and she was crying. And then she said to me she was glad it was over. She actually told me, I'm glad it's over now. And I told her, same thing, I'm glad it's over.
Judy Amar pleads guilty to multiple charges of burglary and is sentenced to 10 years. In 1990, she is released from prison.
It was an obsession. I would go by a house, it was just this haunting feeling. And then I decided that I was going to do things right no matter what. And I was determined not to burglarize anybody anymore.
Since her release, the Bandit Queen has used her unique skills to teach Americans how to make their homes more secure.